Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Swarm Chatter podcast and the second episode of the mini-series, The History of the Early Printed Hebrew Book. As with all the episodes on this mini-series, I'm going to be joined by Michelle Margolis, and this mini-series is sponsored by Sefaria. If you've ever wanted instant access to Torah, Talmud, and hundreds of other Sfarim, all at your fingertips, fully searchable and cross-referenced, Sefaria is for you. Sefaria is a free digital library of Jewish texts in Hebrew and in translation. Whether you're learning Daf Yomi, preparing a shir, or just looking to explore something new, Sefaria makes it easy to find sources and dive deeper. You'll find Rishonim and Achronim, Sefrei Halacha, Mefarshim, Chasidus, and more, all on your phone, tablet, or computer. And everything is completely free. Visit www.sefaria.org, that's SEFARIA.org, to start learning today. And you can find more information about them in the show notes. So, the first episode, we discussed the first century of print in Canabala, and we were in all around Europe, and the press is at that point also in Spain and Portugal, and we were in Italy a little bit, but this episode is going to really turn our focus to Italy and the golden age of Italian printing. We're going to discuss the Soncino family and Daniel Bomberg and some others, and that'll be basically the script for episode 2. So thank you, Michelle, for joining me once again.
Always a pleasure.
So let's jump right in. And who is the Soncino family? If that's even how you pronounce it. You know, many are familiar with them. They see Soncino. They're familiar with those old English translations. Many people maybe even still use their translation of Gemara.
The old one, yeah.
Yeah, but that is not who we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. Let's jump right in with the Soncino family.
So Joshua Solomon, I believe, Soncino was the sort of founder of the dynasty, this book dynasty, and they started printing in the 1480s in the city of Soncino. They give us a lot of information. Gershom Soncino, who's descendant, later gives us a whole lot of information about their family, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But he started printing in Soncino. His family was originally from Germany. They came down and were grateful to the city for allowing them to stay there, which is why they have their printer's mark was in the shape of this tower that's in Soncino. That's what the scholars think. And he started printing. And then he sort of wandered all over. There's actually an article about the wanderings of the Soncino press. He ended up in Brescia. He was in Castelmaggiore. He was really all over Italy. And then ultimately the press ended up in Constantinople. It was in Salonika. It just sort of went all over the place. The press finished in Constantinople. And so he was really, although there was printing of Gemaras in Spain and in Portugal, he was really the first person to print Gemaras that we really have, that we can see. And so he gathered the manuscripts of the Gemara. He created the original layout to have Rashi and Tosfos as the two commentaries that were on the page. All of these innovations were really Soncino. The layout will be Bomberg, which we'll talk about in a minute, but Soncino really started that process. And we're still learning about what he produced. He produced also non-Jewish books. In one case, he produced an anti-Jewish book even. He was a printer who was looking to make a living, and he knew that he make money on all sorts of things.
And that's Yeshua Shlomo you're starting with before we get to Gershom, who's the more famous one maybe to some extent. And they printed many Sfarim. And one of them, the Sefer Ekrim, he says this is a famous quote, Ki mitzian teisei Torah udvar Hashem mi Soncino. The famous play on words. This is something that he wrote.
And they were really incredibly prolific. I mean, we're talking about dozens and dozens of books. By his own count, by Gershom's own count, it was 33 Masechtos of Gemara, and many, many other kinds of works that they put together also. Sort of the classic when you see an old Gemara with woodcut typeface as the first word, the Me'e Masai on Brachos. It's either Bomberg or it's the Soncino based on the woodcuts that they use. They're very distinctive.
And as you said, Yeshua Shlomo was wandering up and down Italy. Why is that? That has to do with the Italian city-states at the time. I think we talked about, but let's just re-emphasize on the podcast. For many times I've said this, but let's re-emphasize that Italy at the time, in fact, until 19th century, was not a country. So You had the Kingdom of Naples, and you had the Papal States. The Pope was a king, and then you had all these little city-states, Milan and Mantua and Ferrara and Venice. And also you had, and many of those in the north were very receptive to Jews, and the Jews really, you had Italian Jews, and you had Sephardim, and you had a lot of Ashkenazim that came down, as you just said, the Soncino family.
Came from the north, yeah.
Correct.
So it really depended on the city-state. So Ferrara was known to be particularly inviting to Jews. We don't have any printing in Venice because Jews weren't allowed in Venice except by special dispensation in the 15th century. And then you see Jews come in, but we'll talk under Bamberg, but that's also under very specific circumstances. And most of the earliest printing in Italy actually are in these teeny tiny towns, Pieve di Sacco, Reggio di Calabria, towns that most people have not heard of. And that's because they were sort of kind of trying to keep a low profile. They didn't want Christians to get worried about printing or too many Jews being in one place, because what ultimately would end up happening is that then the Jews would be expelled from that place if there was any kind of problem or notice or concern, and then they would have to move to another place. So there are all these Jewish books being printed. This is part of a broader question for sort of the people in charge. As books are being printed, there's some concern over what's being produced. Think about the internet today. You can find everything and anything, and people want to regulate the internet, right? So it's the same with books, where if you can produce absolutely anything, you have Martin Luther producing all sorts of books, anti-Catholicism and creating a new religion. Print has a large impact on that. And so the same thing for Jewish printings. Christians become nervous as to whether Jews are going to be printing anti-Christian works, if the Talmud is something that's keeping them from from seeing the quote unquote truth of Christianity. So they're not really able to print in the biggest towns. They don't print in Germany at all in the 15th century, I think I said last time. And so there's a lot of wanderings that we see, or short-lived presses in various places in Italy over that period of time.
And stay tuned to the latter half of this episode for book banning and book burning in the Talmud, and that's something that we're going to get into in the 1550s as we move on in the latter half of the 16th century. But now we're still in the 15th century and getting on to the 16th century. So one of the books that Yeshua Shlomo prints, and he wanders down to Naples, he actually prints the Sefer Augur, which is the second printed Sefer in the lifetime of the author, I believe. The Sefer Augur is Rabbi Yaakov Landau, and that one actually has Haskama, that it seems like it might be the first Sefer with Haskama from Rabbi Yehuda Messer Leon, gives him Haskama. So you have, and Messer Leon is the first.
Messer Leon is the first one in the life of his author.
Right, Nefer Sufim, which we discussed last time. So that's quite interesting in itself.
But it's the same thing. Even the Jews, the Rabbanim, started to get concerned about what's being printed. Because if everything's getting printed, we talked about Nefer Sufim. I mean, that was something that was really controversial. And so you start to have Haskamos. All these things start to happen.
Well, and there are, I think, something that we did speak about, some of the works that were printed by him, and there's a list, even though, we talked about David Rambam's book, and although it's dated, he does have a list of things, maybe he missed something that's newer, but there were definitely things that were printed. You mentioned the Soncinos, and we're talking about Gershom, also publishing even things anti-Judaism. They definitely published non-Jewish things. I mean, one of the last things that he prints in Naples, Yeshua Shlomo, not only is the Augur, he also prints the canon of Avicenna, regularly translated into Hebrew, but these are regular philosophical work. That's not a crazy work. Obviously, they were printing Radak, and they were printing. We talked about Chumash, and they were printing, Rabbeinu Bachya, the Aruch. They're printing like kind of classical stuff, but they're also printing. I think we talked about this last time. How they're printing some other interesting stuff. They were printing Machbaras Emmanuel, which the Shulchan Aruch later says is banned. You can't learn that. They're printing other interesting Musar Sfarim, and they're printing Sfarim al-Atayr. One of the Sfarim. They're printing not necessarily the Sfarim that you're so familiar with always. Some of them they're obviously printing a little bit different. I don't know if he printed it or someone printed. I think Evan Beichen or one of these like satire.
Yeah,
like,
I mean the Garrett, Bechinas Olam. A lot of it is just figuring out what people like. But prior to printing, it was all manuscripts that were commissioned. If you wanted something, you went to a scribe and you said, "Can you write this book for me?" Now, a printer needed to think about what everybody would like. They didn't know yet. There was no bestseller list yet. They had to figure it out. So certain things are obvious. Everybody wants, Rashi. Everybody wants Gemaras. Everybody wants. But when it came to some of the other works, it was just like, let's try it and see what happens.
Yeah, so that's something that we see with Yeshua Shlomo, with the uncle, not the father, actually. So Gershom is his nephew. Gershom or Gershon, really. I keep saying Gershom. I'm not sure which way it is, but that's his nephew. So he goes and what's his story, where he comes from? Because he's really the more famous one to some degree, right?
Yeah, so he's coming into an established press, which, he's sort of the guy who's the heir to this press that's been really effective. They have all sorts of woodcuts. They have all the supplies. They have connections with other printers, so they're able to use woodcuts from other presses. And they start to get a reputation. So he's able to print. He's known as a printer who's printing all sorts of material. Now he writes a lot of what we have about himself comes actually from a much later, one of the last books he printed, Michlol, by David Kimchi, the grammar book, which he prints in Constantinople in 1553. And in that book, on the title page of the book, there's like a teeny bit of information about the printing, and then most of the page is taken up with the history of this press. And this is where he's taking the time to write about all the work that his whole family has done. He talks about his great grandfather in Germany and how he had a disputation with a famous disputation with a Christian, where he won, according to the legend of the family, of course. He writes about how his family has printed 23 Masechtos of Gemara that are all being used in yeshivas, and he's done so much for Klal Yisrael by doing all this printing. And then he talks about the other printers in Venice who have taken my livelihood, and now I can't print, and this is the end of it because of all these other printers who have come forward, and now I can't do this anymore. So he writes a whole long story where you actually get his biography of his family and their printing. So maybe we should talk about that infamous printer who took all of his business. Yes,
Daniel Bomberg. But also, there's something else that, you said he was publishing a bunch of different things. There's also, Amram talks at length about how he went and he, quote unquote, was already censoring. He already was sensitive to this earlier.
Yeah.
And he was already tweaking where it said, Goy, Rashi, he said, reading Amram's translation, those who do not believe in the law of Moses, which you receive from heaven, say, that doesn't mean the Christians.
Careful. He knows.
They already know to be careful early on. This is something that they're very sensitive to, which later things will come to a head in the 1550s.
Yeah, and actually, you see it. There's a recent book by Federico Delbo where he actually compares the sort of anti-Christian texts in Soncino and in Bomberg. And Bomberg was like much less careful about it. Bomberg didn't leave out anything. He didn't erase any of the offensive passages in the Talmud. He didn't in his Siddur, he didn't take out the famous line in Aleinu. It was all there. He was like, why should I take any of this out? Whereas Soncino, who was Jewish, as opposed to Bomberg, who was not, was like, okay, we have to be careful because Christians are going to be reading this, and we don't want to make them mad so that they'll shut down our presses. Whereas Bomberg was Christian and had approvals from the Pope for all the work that he was doing. And so he was coming from a very different kind of perspective. He didn't have this fear that the Jewish printers would have had.
What's the story with, before we get to Bomberg, what's the story with Soncino publishing these, first of all, nothing to do with Judaism? He published these like Latin books, Italian books, and then he's publishing even books against Judaism. This is something that's been discussed for, since a long time. We don't know, for decades, for hundreds of years. What's the story with this?
Yeah, so there's a recent dissertation that came out focusing on Soncino and his works in sort of a more comprehensive way, looking at all of the works that he printed. There's actually a wonderful bibliography as part of that dissertation of everything that Soncino's printed, which is more than has ever been out there, because bibliographers either look at his Christian stuff or at his Jewish stuff. But I want to say he's just a businessman. He knows what's going to sell. He's trying to make a living. And so if this is a way to, he's printing stuff. This happened in the Iberian Peninsula too. The printers in Lisbon were printing in Portuguese and in Latin and in Hebrew because they were Jewish and they wanted to print Jewish stuff. But it was just, we have an audience, we have this capacity to print, so let's make a little money too. I mean, it was also a business.
And at the end of his life, he travels and he ends up dying in Turkey. And as you said, the press moves. So this press with the movable type really moves. It takes movable type to like the next level, all over moving and printing and all. He prints in some places I think we don't even know. He's just printing books all over.
Everywhere, all across the Italian peninsula, and then onward on the way to where he ends up, which is in Constantinople. But you have to remember that's what's so amazing about movable type is that you just pack it up into a box and you take it with you. You can rebuild. I think we said this last time, but it's easy enough to rebuild the frame of the press. It's just wood and some bolts, I guess. But as long as you have the type and the frame, you can build the frames and you have a press and you can redo the business anywhere, and which is very useful for Jews who get kicked out of places quite often, unfortunately.
So I want to put you on the spot and ask you a question, which is, why do you think it is that Gershom and Soncino and the whole Soncino family, I don't think, are very well known by the average person? Meaning, yes, experts know of them, and yes, maybe they know the name Soncino from that English translation, but I think he's not well known. Whereas when you come to Bamberg, the non-Jew, everybody knows Bamberg.
So I think it's actually Soncino's complaint is real here. And that's because Bamberg ultimately printed the entire Gemara, which Soncino could not do. He didn't have the bandwidth for it. He didn't have he wasn't in one place for long enough to do it. He didn't have a huge press the way Bamberg did. He wasn't financed the way Bamberg was. Bamberg had all sorts of privileges that he was allowed to. His Jews were allowed to come into Venice, even though Jews had to usually wear an identifying mark when they came into Venice. But his Jews, Bamberg's employees, didn't have to because he wanted them to be able to work for him. And because our DAF, the concept of a DAF, comes from Bamberg, really, where every page was the same. And the layout was roughly the same. It would change a little bit over the centuries, but it's basically based on Bamberg. And so Soncino sort of falls to the wayside because he only printed 23 Masechtos. So he didn't do as much as Bamberg did. He didn't use. Part of what Bamberg did was he found manuscripts of every single Masechta, Rashi and Tosfos for almost every Masechta. I mean, he went through everything. And so that's incredibly comprehensive in a way that Soncino couldn't hope to reach.
And that's besides for the Bamberg Press. We'll get to the invention of the Makarios Gedolos and
also, yes,
and all the other books, the other classics that they printed at their press. Okay, let's turn to Bamberg. So obviously, there's more to talk about than Soncino, but Bamberg is someone again that's very known. I think the average person heard of him. Hopefully, I think most people don't think it's Daniel Bamberg. I think they understand that he is not a Jewish person. Daniel Bamberg, Daniel von Bambergen. He is a Dutch person. He's from Antwerp, and he comes and he moves down to one of the words Dutch, but he's from Antwerp, and he moves down to Italy. What's his background? A, what's his background? Where's he from? This Christian guy. And B, which I'm sure many people are curious about, is why is he printing Hebrew books? I mean, he is a Hebrew publisher. That is his main occupation.
Yeah. So he's part of this group of people in the Renaissance period known as Christian Hebraists. And they're Christians who believe that in order to truly understand Christianity, you need to study the original texts. Because they were convinced that if they studied all of the original texts, they would find the secret references to Jesus to proving Christianity as correct. They just needed to find them, and the Jews were reading their own texts wrong, and that's why they weren't believing in Christianity. Whereas if these Christians could actually read those texts, they would find this happens a lot with Kabbalah as well, where they go and they say there are all of these hidden mystical meanings in Kabbalah that the Jews aren't seeing, but really they're talking about the truth of Christianity. So Bamberg was, I don't know if he was part of this group or he just saw this as an opportunity. He worked together with Felice de Prato, who was a Jew who converted to Christianity and was very interested in producing these books really originally for Christians. So Daniel was interested in it from a theological perspective as a Christian, and he knew that there was a whole circle of Christian Hebraists that were interested in this kind of study. And so they went ahead and they had to get privileges. The way that it worked in Venice was that you basically got privileges for a monopoly to print. You would be the only printer that would be allowed to print this work. There was another printer, Aldus Manutius, was against printing in Hebrew. But then Aldus Manutius died. So once he dies, you see right away things start to happen. Felice and Bamberg go to request a privilege, and they get a privilege for printing the Talmud. They also asked to employ, and I'm reading here from Angelo Piatelli's wonderful work in the Festschrift for Menachem Schmelzer, which really goes through the sources in Italy, the Venetian sources that talk about Daniel Bomberg. There's a lot of primary source material here. Many of these documents are actually in the collection of Rene Brzezinski. But if you're interested in learning a lot about how practically this press worked, this is a wonderful chapter. So I'm just going to read directly. The petitioners then asked to employ 4 homini Hebrei, chez Siana ben Docti, and forgive my terrible Italian, Jewish men who are well educated, who would be allowed to walk around Venice wearing black berets instead of yellow ones. So again, they wouldn't be accosted by Christians who knew that they were Jewish. They should be able to go to work and nobody should bother them. And indeed, they were given, at least 2 Jews were given this privilege, and Bomberg received the privilege to print certain Hebrew books. Now, there were very specific rules about printing the books. He got the approval to print the Biblia Hebraica, so the Hebrew Bible, which was originally there was going to be just the Bible text, and then he added commentary to create what would become the Mikros Gedolos. And then they started printing. There's a back and forth because privileges were revoked and then they were given again. But the story with the Talmud is really interesting. Soncino got an approval to print the Talmud as long as he would also include the responsiones that Felice de Prato, this Jew that converted to Christianity, they were responses to the Talmud showing how it was false and how Christianity was true. That was required to be printed with the Talmud that Bomberg would print. Bomberg kind of just ignored that part and didn't include that in his printing. But because it was a monopoly, Bomberg now was allowed to print Talmuds, and Soncino was not. And this has to do with where he sort of put Soncino out of business. Soncino would now not be, the Pope granted Bomberg the privilege to print Talmuds, and so Soncino was not allowed to print Talmuds under the jurisdiction of the Pope. So that's why he had to leave Italy ultimately, because he would no longer, if he wanted to continue printing Gemaras, he couldn't do it because of this monopoly that Bomberg had.
So, first of all, I'll correct myself, Bomberg wasn't Dutch, he was Flemish. Can't make that mistake. People from Antwerp correct me. Oh, it's not Dutch. Okay, no, that's Amsterdam. Correct, different. We're going to get to the Dutch in the next episode when we get to Amsterdam. But okay, now, you mentioned Bomberg, exactly. That's something very important that has to do with privileges, and this is something that I'm sure we'll get to a little bit more. This will come up even more when we're going to get to the fight between Bragadini and Giustiani and then the burning of the Talmud. But this is something that Neil Netanel discusses at length in his book From Maimonides to Microsoft, which will come up, and this is the whole Haskamas, and privileges were tied to this kind of loosely. They were,
Highly recommend that podcast, by the way, if you want to hear more about it. But
yes, an old Farm Chatter podcast.
It was great.
A couple of years ago. Yeah, go check it out. And so privileges are something that, how do you control who's printing what? And this is a problem often when someone publishes it, and then this is it's a new technology, so people are stealing different things. Again, think of the internet as a great analogy from different, it kind of as a new technology evolves and people are just taking things. So they would have these privileges. Who's allowed to print what? And especially with Jews printing text, you would have to go through the Pope or through the council or through the town, whoever was in charge, the Duke, whatever city you're in. Now, although we mentioned Italy city-states, important to understand that the Pope wields enormous power and influence because these are Christians. This is especially before the Reformation. So everybody is Catholic. In Italy, everyone really stays Catholic, but everyone's Catholic and the Pope is really in charge. So the Pope's going to threaten to excommunication. I mean, of course, in Venice, you have the Doge or the councils in charge. They don't want to, run afoul of the Pope. I mean, most of these places don't want to. So they're not trying to do that. So the Pope still wields enormous power. They write to the Pope. This is a lot of these things. These are ecclesiastical questions, as we'll see, especially as it comes later again, referenced again when it comes to the burning of the Talmud. And also the popes are changing, and that does matter. Which pope is in charge, and is it a receptive pope? Is it one of the Medici popes, or who are more receptive? Or we get later, we'll get to Paul IV, terrible in Russia.
But Bomberg actually had to keep requesting the privileges every time there was a new pope.
And he had to get it from Venice also. In Venice, the city itself had to grant the privilege. So Bomberg had to get the privilege. But as you say, that privilege knocks it out because once Bomberg gets the privilege, sorry, it's to knock everyone out. And he's going to say, I want the privilege because I don't want my books. If Sonshino is printing a Talmud and Bomber is printing a Talmud, there's not that many people who are interested in buying them, and books are very expensive at the time as well. Books are not cheap. I think it's something we discussed the last episode. Books are very expensive. There are numbers on this, right? It costs like some average person's like full year's salary or something. I'm trying to remember. Like it was very, very expensive to buy a book, and we can still see these books today. And we've talked about this previously, and also I also often talk about this in the Auction Chatter episodes, where you see these original books. They're beautiful. The paper, the high quality paper, and the print. It's just gorgeous. And you see these books, you understand they were expensive. These were not cheap productions, especially the bigger books. And so this was something that Bomberg and others wanted a privilege. They wanted to be able to have full control on printing the book. So this really knocks Sonshino out.
Yeah, and in fact,
and
you
we'll
see the last Masechta that Sonshino prints is Chulin, that he prints in 1519, which is just after Bomberg gets his privilege. Like, clearly that's the end of Sonshino as far as Gemaras.
So I want to read a few quotes from, again, quoting Amram's wonderful book, The Makers of Hebrew Books in Italy, although dated. We'll give that qualifier every time.
Say it every time.
Yeah, okay, but still. He has some very nice quotes in his Old English to translate. So one of them is from Avram de Balmes, or de Balme, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Balmes. So he says, when I came to Venice, the congregation of princes and magnates, I saw our people engaged in pious conversations and diligently attending the house of study. But I found no heifer that would be yoked with mine, for no one sought any knowledge that had not already been long expounded. Each one thought only of increasing his wealth, and I concluded that it was a time for me to embrace the bosom of a stranger, to worship at a foreign shrine. And behold, there came to me Daniel Bomberg, a man greatly beloved, of whom glorious things were spoken. He was a Christian, and he feared his God. The feet of his father did not stand at the foot of Sinai, but to him did I turn all my fountains, for he was one of those who spend their money freely in the service of God, to print Bible, Mishnah, and decisions beyond all other printers. He also studied Hebrew and crowned himself therewith, and all his deeds shine like the splendor of the sky. And when he saw me, he asked me to write a book, a Hebrew grammar. And as the nation among whom we were exiled think ill of us because there is none of us to serve in this sanctuary, I determined to obtain the favor of Daniel in the service of my Creator. And so he published this is his work that he published on, it's called Mikneh Avram, I believe. And another quote from Yosef HaKayin. Yosef HaKayin is the famous historian, actually had an episode recently about Emek Habacha on the podcast. He said, in the year 1513, Daniel Bomberg of Antwerp began to print, and he brought forth from darkness unto light many books in the holy tongue. Constantly there went in and out of his house many learned men, and he never withdrew his hand from giving unto all in accordance with their demands and to the extent of the means with which God had endowed him. The said Daniel was born a Christian. Neither in his parents nor in his forebears was there a drop of Jewish blood. So that also speaks to, some say, oh, well, maybe he was Jewish. No, he was not Jewish, and nothing to do he was not Jewish at all. Now, we're going to get to other people that worked in his press. Yaakov ibn Chaim ibn Yo, especially very important with the Yerushalmi, I did episode Yaakov Meir. Also, he's important with Democratic Gedolos, which we have to return to, because this is a very important text, and one which was created by Bomberg. But there's also Cornelio Adelkind, who is Jewish to some degree. We're not sure. We have some questions still about his lineage. But one thing that he writes, during my youth, I devoted all my energies to helping to print many great and precious books, as may be seen in all books printed at Daniel Bomberg's press, in which my name is inscribed in front and in back. When I grew old, I considered that I had done nothing for pious young women, and for men that had not time to study in their youth, but who would like to spend their time on Sabbath or festivals reading appropriate matters, and not Titrev Baron or the Shoni Gluck. So these are books. And for the sake of those who want to read God's words, for there are few Jewish books written in German that are well and correctly translated, I went to Elijah Levita, this is Leo Bacher, the grammarian, and entered into agreement with him to translate several books for me, and first of all the Psalms according to rules of grammar. And he goes on and on. The point is that also that he says, it ends off, therefore I beg you, dear pious young women and men, buy the Psalms cheerfully and kindly, and give us money that we may soon begin to print Proverbs. Amen. And this says, this we beg of you, your servants Cornelio and Mayor Parenzo. So what's interesting here, worth pointing out, is that you see later on, he was saying that Bomberg, and we know this, was printing serious books, not books for women or for men that did not learn it. He was printing real classical books. That's what you see from Adelkin's quote. But let's turn back to him, and we come upon the... I
will say, often those books for women and men like women were the moneymakers. So they printed them in order to finance the important and scholarly ones.
Well, we still see that today, right? The Hamoin Am buys... There are books that are very popular. Like, wait, why is this popular? And because that's what people buy, the simple books, or even still, Sidurim, Machzorim, Chumashim. Those are the basic things that sell, especially for regular average people. And so that's what you see here. But that wasn't the case. Bomberg's press was printing real top-notch, top-quality scholarship. And you talk about the
From
Shas.
manuscript. He talks about getting manuscripts of the various books that he was printing.
I don't think it's emphasized enough that if you go look at a Tfus Venezia, when you see Tfus Venezia, anyone who has any Gemara and it says, oh, quote, and this is a Girsah from Tfus Venezia, that is talking about Bomberg's Shas.
Yeah.
And there's 2 editions, by the way. There's a first, and then he later on there's a second edition.
And maybe a third, and maybe a fourth.
But Bomberg went with the help of his editors and the acquisition. You think of an acquisition editor and a copy editor, whatever it is, but with the help of all of them, and he had many Jewish people and those who later converted, including Yaakov ibn Chaim ibn Adonio and others. They went and they would go, and this was a real job. First of all, if you take out any Venice Gemara, any Bomberg Gemara, you'll see that although everyone always talks about the Vilna Shas having the Tzuras Adaf that we're familiar with, and that we know, the Bomberg Gemara is very, very, very similar. You basically can turn, someone quotes something about Baba Daf Chaf, if it's not on Daf Chaf in the Bomberg, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's basically Ram was in Vilna, who we'll talk about in a later episode, was working off of Bomberg. Everybody's working off of Bomberg. And Bomberg is, and Sochino to extent, but Bomberg is the, Gemara, but he was also, like you're saying, he was acquiring, he was acquiring.
He did all the background scholarship.
Just to remind everybody, there's not one manuscript of Rashi and Shas, right? There's not one manuscript of Taisis. In fact, there are many different Bali Taisis and different Mesechtas, as we've discussed in this podcast, different episodes. So he had to go, and he and the press had to go find these manuscripts floating around. They had to, many of which we don't have anymore, and that's why Yaakov Meir's book about the Yerushalmi is so fascinating, because we have, I think it's in Leiden, we have the manuscript, the inky fingers, the one that they actually worked on. You can see their comments in the margin and what to include, what not to include, what to move around, what to tweak. And in that one, you actually see, I think it's Pizik Tone, and Yaakov ibn Chaim. You see what changes they made. They made certain editorial decisions. So when we talk about, it's important to emphasize when we talk about and how important it is the Tfus Rishon. Everyone always says, went back to Mugal Pi Tfus Rishon, and this is the Tfus Rishon Shteit Azoy. Yes, those are things that we've had. Of course, it's very important. That's what the Rabbanim and Gedolim have had through the centuries to learn from and to paskin from. But this was set up at this press by a non-Jew and some converts and some very important people. And this is who's doing it. This press is where it's coming from. And at this time,
I would say
in the 16th century.
Right. So Bomberg was the owner of the press. Bomberg wasn't setting the type. Bomberg wasn't editing the texts. So it's important to recognize that there were actually Jews involved in putting it together, but the actual owner, the guy who was financing the whole deal, was not.
The CEO, the boss,
was
not a Jew.
Yeah.
And this was his business.
And some of it, and there were decisions that he made that, and we could talk about the Mikras Gedolos, putting in certain commentaries that until that time were somewhat controversial.
Yeah. Let's turn to the Mikras Gedolos.
Sure.
Let's talk about Mikras Gedolos. This is very important. Jordan Pinkauer's massive dissertation that never was published as a book, as a dissertation, goes through the Mikras Gedolos. And let's talk about the Mikras Gedolos, because this is something today I think it's accepted as of course you have Mikras Gedolos. Not only that, today's Mikras Gedolos did differ from Bomberg. Obviously, there was no Orach Chaim HaKadosh, there was no Kli Yakar. These are later on additions. Well, let's talk about that core Mikras Gedolos, that idea to create this Mikras Gedolos.
I mean, the very fact that you have the Torah text and then commentaries on the same page, this is monumental. And they talk about it in the 15th century too, about how amazing it is that before you needed multiple manuscripts to study anything, and now you have everything on one page. But again, think about the layout, just like with the Gemara, but more. So you have a text in the center, you have the Torah text in the center, you of course have Unkelis, you have the Aramaic Targum, and then you have Rashi's sort of a given on the page. But then what else would you include? If you're just somebody sitting down for the first time saying, okay, what are the commentaries that are the most important to include? And they start making these decisions. They put in Spanish commentators. They put in Ashkenazi commentators. They put in people who maybe would never have been studied by the same person at the same time. But the editors of this text are saying, okay, well, I think people like this and people like this, and these are good ones, and so we're going to put these all in. And so they really shape when we learn Torah today, what are the go-to mafarshim that we go to.
Ibn Ezra ends up in there, others end up in there, Ralbag ends up, we talk about Ralbag was controversial. We do Messer Leon was like, Ralbag, no, we don't like Ralbag. Now Ralbag only ends up in Nach, not in Chumash.
Yeah, interesting. And then in the 1524 Mikros Gedolos, which is really the second edition, is considered the monumental edition. It was completely redone from the first edition. It had more commentaries. It was much more beautiful. If you have a chance to see a 1524 Mikros Gedolos, I cannot encourage you enough to go see it. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous, beautiful book that you just want to sit down and learn from. But in the introduction, it says when it lists the commentaries, it also says the commentary hamiyuchas l'Rashi. It doesn't say it's Rashi. It says it's the one that's miyuchas to Rashi, and that's the one we use.
Which has been discussed in the podcast. Again, I'll reference all the other episodes. Like that printed Rashi, the number is, and they got from grocery somewhere like 24% is not Rashi. Whatever the number is, 10 to 24% is not. So, they use different manuscripts. They were involved in the work, going out and acquiring and finding. There was no library, so you don't just, it's amazing. Here we're recording this 2025, right? You can just go now and go online and find scans of these manuscripts all over the world.
Right?
Well, correct. Safari for printed text, but then you can go and find a National Library Visitor.
You can see the manuscripts.
And we're going to talk about this in episode 4, the internet and how that comparable and the differences from this fascinating new world of print in the 16th century. And so they had to go around and really acquire these manuscripts or copy them or whatever was going on, because they were still copying at that time, even though this is something, I think we talk about manuscript culture, even though there's book culture at the time. And it's so important. And they were putting in there, also, it's important to mention also that you say the second edition, there are changes from the first and the second.
Yes.
One, for example, is Rabbi Avram Farasol, who David Ruderman wrote a book on him many decades ago. He was a fascinating individual who we should talk about on the podcast more. He has not been talked about in the podcast, really. He writes a commentary on Eiv, a big commentary. That was in the first edition, and then no more. It was not included again. It's not in any Mikros Gedolos. So there are things included originally that aren't included later, that are left out.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing on manuscripts, which is that if you have 2 contradictory manuscripts, or 5, it was the editors that would then decide what the final text would be. So they're saying, okay, well, this seems to make the most sense, but there's a lot of editorial input, and so you have to be careful when you say, this is the text that this Rav wrote. I'm not going to name anybody because I don't want to get in trouble, but it could be or it could be not, because the editors made those decisions.
This is why I referenced before, and I talked about, people say, oh, it's frustration, and it is true, and it's very important that that's what was used throughout the centuries by Rabbanim and Poskim, and I'm not making light of that. However, the fact is, and Yaakov Meir talked about this, and his book shows, because we have the inky fingers, we have the actual copy of the Yerushalmi Ksaveh that they use, you see their editorial changes. You see what they decided to tweak. They actually made those changes. That was a couple of people in a press making those editorial decisions. They needed to make an editorial decision, and they did.
So, in fact, the Rabbanim were concerned about this. You have the Maharsha, who's later in the century, he's late 16th, early 17th century. He writes in his introduction to the Agadata on Gemara, before Maseches Brachos, he writes a whole long introduction where he says, I have something else that I need to say. I need to talk about how what has been edited in the Talmud. The printers who sees this edits of the text thinks that it's accurate, and he brings it to print. And he doesn't, anybody who looks carefully at it will find complete errors in them and many mistakes in these new Masechtos of Gemara. There are so many, if you see an older version, if you see a manuscript version, go with the manuscript version, because it's going to be better, because the printers think they know what they're talking about. And so they make changes that they shouldn't make because they have no idea what they're talking about. So you see this in the Maharsha, within 100 years of these Gemaras being printed, Rabbanim are concerned about it as something that might be a change, that might be wrong.
Something to point out, it's, again, check out the original. You can find scans of it even online. It's beautiful and it's well worth seeing. And this is an important creation, if you will. And perhaps one day do a full episode just dedicated to discussing Mikros Gedolos. But so Bomberg prints Mikros Gedolos. He does Yerushalmi. He does Bavli. He prints many other things. I mean, those are the texts. And he publishes many of these very important texts. Obviously, Shulchan Aruch comes much, much later. And Torah was already printed before. And it's printed,
But he prints it again.
Yeah, but again, this is not the Torah that we know. There's no Beis Yosef, there's no Bach. These things come much later. He just prints the basic Torah. So Mikros Gedolos, even though it changes, it's like that idea, and most of the Mefarshim, it's like, this is Bomberg's creation. The Bavli also, even though things are added. Because in Bomberg's, you have Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and you have Rush in the back.
Yeah. Very few commentaries other than that.
He doesn't add, there's a few other things inside of Bamberg. He also included Piskei Tosfos as well as the Pirush Shas Rambam. So that together with the Rosh. So again, very bare bones compared to what we'll think of today when we think of a Gemara.
But you see, when you look at actual copies of the Bambergs, you start to understand how people were using them. So the copy that we have at Columbia actually includes Masaras HaShas on the margins. So somebody wanted to know where the citations were in the Gemara, and so they added it in by hand. And then you see a few editions later, it's added in the printed Gemara. Similarly, the Shittim Mekubatzes, which is normally at the end of the Gemara today, and the Yeshiva of the Shittim Mekubatzes, so his students actually wrote his commentary on the Gemara on the page of the Gemara. There are a number of volumes that we know. Columbia has one, but there's some at the National Library and other places where they actually wrote his pirush on the daf because they wanted to be learning it as part of their learning of the Gemara in that particular yeshiva. So you have different ways, you can learn different ways of learning just by looking at the Bambergs and how they were used in different times and places.
And for those interested in Bamberg, and it's still very readable and really beautiful, there was, I don't know if it's still around, Or HaChachma printed a 10-volume set. It was a Maduras Tzilum, a photo offset. Really very readable, very beautiful. And it's important. I, myself, personally, it was a number of years ago, and I was working on Teres Chaim and Avodah Zarah. And when I was working on my Teres Chaim, I came across, he quoted a girsa on the Rosh. And I went to the Rosh, and it didn't have that girsa. And Pulcharifta says, like Kachiyar Girsa. So you see there was something going on. And I pulled out the Venice, and I had seen from other places that the Teres Chaim was using the Bamberg or something that was literally exactly Bamberg. And it had that Girsa. In the Bamberg Rush, it had that Girsa. And the newer Gemaras didn't rectify. That's just an issue anyways. The Rush, I don't think it's ever been redone properly with proper notes. So it's still important for those interested to check out the Bamberg Gemara. He's still that's still the standard, Tfus Rishon as we know it. Again, although there's Anshino and other Gemaras, that's still like the main one, we'll call it, for Tfus Rishon. Again, it's not Tfus Rishon, it's Sosvinatzia, but that's what we know. So that's with that. Obviously, there's the Yerushalmi as well, which we could talk about. I'll reference the podcast Yaakov Meir and his book, Tfus Rishon, which is well worth reading, an excellent book with a lot about that. And you could learn about Inky Fingers and how they actually worked, how they were working at the press, because we see them with the one main manuscript that they're working off of Yerushalmi and many other works that Bamberg is printing. And Bamberg publishes much more than just these works. These are just the classics, but he obviously publishes many more, Svarim.
Yeah, I would also say on this edition, now that I'm looking at it, like I mentioned before, that Bamberg was not so concerned about anti-Christian texts because he was Christian. You see that texts that you pulled out a Sanhedrin, so I of course went to take a look. The text that was censored in later editions is not censored in the original Bamberg. Correct. Because he didn't care about it. He wasn't concerned about it.
Correct. At this
time,
so
you can see the original text.
Correct. And so there are other Sfarim that he's printing then. He's printing Chumas Hadeshen, they're printing Shuvas Marik, he's printing, obviously, Sidurim and Machzorim. Machzorim really aren't Yom Tov Machzorim, they're like year-round Sfarim, but he's printing, with the Sephardi, right, or he's printing the Roman Nusach, so Nusach Roima, this is in Italy, he's printing Shuvas or Rashba. Obviously, Gemara is a major thing, Yerushalmi is a big deal. Rif, because Rif is not in the back of the Gemara at the time. Smag, we mentioned Tor, we mentioned Rashi, of course, and Rashi on Nach is printing Chuvas Ramban. I think we mentioned Miknavram, the bombs. We mentioned he's printing Rekanati, or Menachem Rekanati, not Rekanti, Italian Kabbalah commentary. The first, I think, Kabbalistic commentary on Chumash that's published at the time. The Tzor Amor from Saba, he's printing, many, many more. There's, again, another extensive list in the back of Amram, and then I'm sure there's been much more extensive lists compiled since that he publishes many, many different things. And so he's, the press operates for many years, many decades. And so they're publishing many of the classics that we know, whatever those Sfarim are, the Tfus Rishon comes from this press that they were putting together. And really all of any Bamberg, anyone at NAC is really beautiful, high quality paper.
Yeah.
What's the paper at this time? We talked about paper the last
episode. It's
rag
paper. So it's made from cloth, essentially. It's beautiful. I mean, the Bamberg, and they're big. They're just very clear volumes. They're really lovely. I want to mention also in the Mikras Gedolos that there's a small edition. There was a quarto edition that was produced that was just the Torah text. And that was really produced for Christians. I mean, there was for those who wanted to study the Old Testament in its original Hebrew, there's a quarto edition that's produced as well.
And remind everyone, why is it called quarto?
Because the paper was folded twice so that you have 4 pages that's made out of one big sheet. A large book is called a folio because it's only folded once. The big original piece of paper is folded once to make 2 pages.
And actually, if you look in the original Bomberg or in a photo offset, you'll see at the bottom of the page they have these like Aleph Bays 1, 2, and you're like, what's going on? That's telling them the fold and where it belongs and which page of the
how
fold
to bind it. Yeah,
correct. But a Gemara was a folio.
A Gemara was a folio. Yeah, and also they
how many times was it
folded once?
Folded one time.
Think of one piece of paper folded once, but it's a very big piece of paper, so they would be pretty large.
Correct. So what is Daniel Bomberg's legacy, or is his legacy, obvious?
Well, I mean, he made all these. He invested. I mean, when you read the praise of his workers, his employers, his employees, when they write about how he spared no expense and he was Marbitz Torah b'Yisrael, and they go on in his praise. And the fact of the matter is, he went out and he found the oldest manuscripts he could find, the best manuscripts he could find. I don't know how he defined best, but he didn't tell us. But he went and he compiled all this information. This was probably not something a Jew would have been able to do, because you had to have access to all sorts of things. There were manuscripts that were in monasteries. There were manuscripts that were in other places that a Christian would have had access to that a Jew may not have had. So he really did do an incredible thing by bringing all this together. And the fact of the matter is that the Gemaras that you look at today, the Mikros Gedolos that you read today, it is all because of the work that he, I would say, financed, and the work that his employees did. It's a huge legacy.
The end of Bomberg's life, he goes back to Antwerp and dies there, I believe.
I think so. His son-in-law got his types, so they continued printing on with the Bomberg's type in Venice, though. So his press continued.
The press continues, and then other presses arise, and this really brings us forward. And obviously, for all of this, there are, as you've referenced, a bunch of books,
many
countless
books,
articles, and there's so much written on all this. And this is a cursory overview. This is really not meant to be, again, I go back to when I did the series on Shabtai Tzvi a couple of years ago, 15-part series, and people were like, well, you didn't do this, that, and that. I'm like, well, this is not supposed to take the place of like serious research and books and courses or classes or whatever it is.
Yeah.
This is a podcast series, again, supposed to inform and to enlighten and to teach, but obviously for much more, we're definitely overlooking things and being very general about certain things here on the podcast. So now we really move forward. There are other presses and minor presses throughout Italy and then in Venice. But now we really move towards censorship. And this is something that, as we mentioned, you look at Bomberg, he's got all those Gemaras, everything's in there. They're not really so nervous. I mean, we mentioned Sanchino earlier was removing certain things. And obviously the Jews are kind of nervous.
The Jews are much more aware of the danger.
They're definitely aware, but as the church becomes more aware of the dangers of print because of Martin Luther and what's going on in Germany. And just in brief, Martin Luther is this priest, and he's essentially breaks off and kind of the impetus for the Catholic Reformation, which creates Protestantism and all its offshoots, and we're not going to get into that here. But the church eventually hits back, and we have the Counter-Reformation, and one of the consequences of the Counter-Reformation is Jewish books and Jews get attacked. As always, the Jews are always blamed, especially in Europe at that time. In the early modern period, the pre-early modern period.
As opposed to now when Jews are blamed, never blamed for anything.
No, of course they are, but then especially the Jew is blamed. And so they go after the Jews. And so what happens? This is censorship and the burning. This is going to lead up to the burning of the Talmud, which kind of the I guess, I don't know if it's the straw that broke the camel's back or what causes it.
The
is this
narrative
fight
around it,
between Giustiani and Bragadini, these two publishers in Venice, and they print a Rambam, Mikros Gedolos, with commentaries, and then there's his Maram Padua, Ramir Katzenelbogen is printing, and with one, and then the other one gets upset, and they write a letter. Even, in fact, the Ramah writes a tshuva on this, and he says it's okay, whatever. And this
he says don't buy the Rambam from the other press.
Stealing it. And so again, this is talked about at length in Professor Neil Nathanel's book From Maimonides to Microsoft, and we discussed it there. But what ends up happening is They try to appeal to the Pope, and the Pope at that time, Paul IV, I think it's his Paul IV already, a bad guy, Russia, as it will say. Yeah, they talk about him. I did a podcast a number of years ago with Martina Mampieri about her book. She translated this kind of...
also a good podcast.
Thank you. This is someone...
They called him the evil Pope. Yeah,
he's the evil Pope, and it's written a kind of an autobiography, a diary, if you will, talking about the ills and what happened at the time. And before you know it, the Gemara is burned, and they confiscate all the Gemara at the Talmud. The Talmud was burned, and then they introduced the index, I think, for banned books and censorship.
Index prohibitorum.
Yeah, if you want to talk about some of this. And so we end up with censorship and no Gemara.
Yes. So what happens in Italy is that they produce this index, and most of the books on the index, this is from the Catholic Church, are books that are banned. So these are books of philosophy. These are books of science. These are books of completely not Jewish. But the Talmud and its commentaries appears in every single volume, almost every single volume. And so the Talmud is now not allowed to be printed in any Catholic state or under the Pope. And so the Jews in Italy need to figure out how they're going to study Gemara. Gemaras are now banned. You can't have them, and you have to submit your library to the censor. So you have to, or have a really good hiding place for your banned book, for your illegal books when they come. So this leads to the rise of sort of other Sfarim that are not the Gemara, but can get you sort of what the Gemara does. So one of these Sfarim is the Ein Yaakov, which is the Agarata in the Gemara. So if you learn the Agarata, you can sort of infer what the halacha is from that. And also what they would end up doing sometimes would be to, when they took out material that was deemed offensive, they didn't relay out the text. So they didn't reset the text so that it would all be clean. They would just leave a blank space. And so if you're reading a book and you see a blank space, you know that there's something that's supposed to be there. And many times we see in the original copies, it was just filled back in. So you have material that was censored, that was not allowed to be printed, and it was filled back in. Or if it actually did get printed, and then there was a whole team of censors, of expurgators, Christians, often Jews who converted to Christianity, who their job was to review these books and make sure that they were appropriate, that there was the sort of chief censor was Domenico Arisalmitano. He was a converted Jew. His last name had been Yerushalmi. So if you Latinize it, it's Arisalmitano. And he wrote a book called Sefer Hazikuk, which is how to censor Jewish books. And it went through all the majority of the big Sfarim. And he said, okay, in this page, you cross out this. On this page, you cross out this. But really, the censors, most of these censors did not actually read Hebrew very well. They would look for the word Goy, and they would see the word Goy Kadosh talking about Bnei Israel, and they would cross out the word Goy because they thought it meant Christians. Or they would look for the shoresh for Galach, for meaning, so it's a monk or a priest, right? And there's halacha about ligaleach, about shaving, and that gets crossed out. So there's all sorts of things that you see that clearly they didn't know very much about what they were talking about. Often you see a censor's signature on a book. It's usually at the end of the book. They would sign their name, the date they reviewed the book, and then there's nothing crossed out in the whole book. So did they actually look at the book, or were they just like going one at a time, signing book after book after book? Some yes, some no. We have a copy of Slichos that has, it almost looks like they took a paintbrush and they deleted like swaths of material in the book. And then other books which are known to have anti-Christian or offensive to Christianity texts that are completely blank, but also have the censor signature. So it sort of depended on who they were, who the censor was.
We obviously know a lot about it, but to read a few quotes about it, the Mincha Blula of Ramanachem Kohen Rappaport, his Sefer Torah in Parshas Vayisabrocha, Mimina Eish Taslamai, he says, "V'remez gamkein, it's a remez to us, ala Churban Hagadol, the great Churban Asher ro einenu that our eyes saw, v'nesenu arabim b'chol Galilas Italia, in the whole Italy, Sreifas Torah Shabal Peh, the burning of the Torah Shabal Peh, Asher b'shnas Shin Yud Dalid Yad Hashem hoisabanu. Yatsa hagzerim iroimi. The gzerim left Rome. Lihinase in the machelas eish to give over into the fire. Ubi Venetia in the ear of the city of Venice. Oile nayim shekachro. Woe is to the eyes that saw this. B'yoim yud gimel v'yud dalad mar cheshvan. 13 and 14 of mar cheshvan. Shin yud dalad eish tamid loy kava. The fire wasn't put out. V'kavati eyam elu. And I established these days a life for me. B'chol shana v'shana every year. Lotzim b'chiyu mispaid for fasting and for crying. Because this day was as hard for me as the burning of the Beis Hamikdash, is what he says. And also another book is Lechem Yehuda Lirma, and this is a book, a commentary on Pirkei Avos. And it's a very interesting commentary, and he actually also, what's relevant for print, also worth mentioning that he also says before that he says, I'm quoting from the Rambam and the Barbanel. And, don't worry, even though I quote from them, so you can just buy my book and be able to find everything you want. This is something that's like a compendium because books are very expensive. You have to buy books. But he says, he's talking about his commentary. He says, I decided that I'm going to print it, and I called it Lechem Yehuda, etc. And then he says, and he printed it in Venice. Uberoi shnas ki heimar shakaili, again, Gozra Malchus Roimi Bechol Malchus Edoim, in the old Malchus Edoim, Vesorfu HaTalmud VeHaGodish HaTalmud Shal Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaviv, which we talked about. In Yaakov was around, but he says they burned all of it. Ubechodesh Mar Cheshvan Keshmoi Kain Hu, it was bitter month like Mar Cheshvan. Gozru Bevenetia in Venice, Vesorfu HaTalmud VeHaGodes HaNeskaris, everything was burned. Vegam Harav Alfasi VaMishnayis, the Rif and the Mishnah, Beyoim Shabbos Kodesh. Ubetoichem Sorfu Kol Sifri Shehet Fasti. They burned all of my books. Shahayu, how much did he print? This is also very important. How many books did they print on a run? Elev Vitov Kuf Sfarim. 1,500 pieces. They don't print today, so it's like 1,500 copies. That's how much he printed. But Oifen Shef Sadati Bahem, Kol Mash Ahili Venezia. I lost everything in Venice. I didn't have anything left. The original is what we talked about. The original
the edited
working copy. Because they would throw it out. Afilu Allah Echel Lizikar. I didn't have one page for remembrance. I had to rewrite the whole thing. I wrote 3 prakim. Matzasi sefer echem min atfus. I found one copy biad goyim, non-Jewish. Lachu I say mehal eish. They took it off the fire. V'konisi I said b'dami mekarim, and I bought it for a lot of money. V'reisi mitoich, and I saw on it shazakeni Hashem yisbarach v'asisi hasheni yoser b'shleimus ben rishon. I did a better job in the second than the first time. V'isafti by Jerusalem ra harbe al shalchach v'me'ena mishnayis shad Jerusalem ksuvim bohem. So this is a very poignant retelling of what happened. And by the way, as a postscript to that story, so first of all, the Sefer has been redone by Vat Shalom, but as a few years ago, but as a postscript, there is one copy in the world of the original. I don't know if it's that one that he found. There is now a copy of that first edition.
At the Bodleian?
I believe it's in the Bodleian.
Yeah.
It's one copy. There's one copy left. And also, you'll find in Italy after, they didn't always have Gemara, but they did have Ein Yaakov, even though he says they burned it. And
they called it Ein Yisrael.
Ein Yisrael, correct.
So that nobody would know.
But it was Agadato. So there's a book on a few Masechtas, Sefer, published, Machon Yerushalayim published a couple years ago, Chidushay Rabbeinu Moshe Kazis, and it's actually written not ala Shas, it's written ala Ein Yaakov. And one of the things there, they quote that the Shiltei Geber, and we've talked about him, we talked about him in the last episode, and one of the things he writes is, when he's talking about he doesn't have Sfarim, he says, "V'gam mipnei ha'maniya hayadua," the great maniya, not allowing me. I'm not going to say what it is. Lo ra'isi mashe ba'ulei amro le'em b'gemara. I didn't see what was said in the Gemara. V'im yirtza Hashem shetuchal b'tuvoi v'chazdi liyonik dvash v'chilev divrei Chazal. If I'm able, hopefully, to see what Chazal say. Sham v'yachpatz Hashem sheyigam ken zeber shoyin malkeinu v'sareinu v'chulu. Hopefully I get to see it. V'kvar yadat, you already know. Kani loy ba'asi chas v'shalom lachal k'divrei Chazal. I'm not Chalila arguing on Chazal. Me'olam v'ad olam. Kim emes v'divrei emes. There, of course, everything that Chazal say is true. Baruch shebachar v'sheyivcher b'hem u'b'mishnasam u'b'terasam. Basically, he didn't know what the Gemara said. So he says, if I'm arguing on Chazal, I don't intend to. I'm not trying to. I have no idea what they're saying. And something that's even more at length, and this is a little later. This is also famous to some degree. The Sefer Trumas, which is a Rishon, Reb Shmuel ben Yitzchak Sradi, and there's a commentary called Gedulei Truma. Reb Azariah Figo or Pikio, he's the latter half of the 16th century, 1579 to 1647 or something thereabouts. So he writes an introduction. If anyone wants to read it, first of all, read introductions of Sfarim. They're so fascinating.
There's so much there. There's so much there.
So much.
Also, Colophon sometimes at the end. There's all this information.
Yeah, at the end, at the beginning, but oftentimes those don't get reprinted in the new editions.
No,
you have to go back to the originals.
Yeah.
They're not there, and they don't say what the little printer wrote in, and they delete a lot of it. So, but this introduction is so fascinating. He first of all, he says in the beginning, he starts off just how he and just I'll read a little bit. I don't want to read too many quotes, but I think it's so fascinating. It's worth just highlighting some of it. And he says that in his youth, he went and he halachti bohem achrei hevel ba'avas yaldei nachrim limudim chitzaynim iminim shenim. He says, he went and he learned Svarim chitzaynim. He was learning other things. And he was enjoying it. And I'll just, he says, and later on he realized that he should not do this and he should learn Torah. And he says, Al kain samti panei legarish es amazes. I divorced this woman. V'amarti lenafshi shuvi el gevirtech hagemara harucha bakol. Go back to Gemara. Val tamiteni milapech bo v'afayich bo dekula bo ulei chonashem tzvakes lias terasei shashuai v'lo yizker chatas neurai apishi. Don't remember my sins of my youth that I was learning these secular sources. It says, I learned Gemara, etc. He learned it, and he went in Venice. He lived in Venice. And he says, until the time came, he went and he was called on to Pisa, on the other side of Italian Peninsula, and he became the rabbi. Again, so he did learn Gemara in his youth, which is important to mention. But he does say, and he continues, and he says that, however, when he went there, he says, this is what he says. He says, Ki lo nimtzu usham, lo soifrim. He says, I didn't find soifrim, v'lo svarim, l'kvoya yeshiva shel iyon. Asher haya limud ha'oyev v'anichzav. I didn't have enough books to learn from. V'chrachti lias mestapik b'muat ha'musig mimeni, v'lisboinin beini lebeini b'ktsas sefer ha'poiskim zalim tzabiyad. Basically, I didn't have a lot of books. He says he didn't have a lot of books. And actually, it's quite fascinating. Just to read the rest of the introduction, how he decided he wanted to write a commentary on something. He should write on the Rambam, on the Torah. There already was commentaries. He's not going to write there. He's going to write it on a different sefer. I didn't want to. And he says, I didn't have this sefer from Venice. I told someone to send it to me. It was actually printed in Salonika. I told someone to send it to me, and he got a hold of it. Going on, etc. And then he says, continuing on, he says, however, Efes, ki oz haya kasha alay ma'oi, lekarva lamaloch, bavur mashahiyam mavur, yitzarech behechrich, lemishe kadis be'in, someone who tries to learn be'in, bezesh ye'etz lekol chibur hagemara, liris kol davar m'kayim rishasha. You have to learn everything properly. V'gam, you have to also have gam rabbim misifri g'dei lachreinim zal, asher yadanu b'tei chibureim, haviyom elashenis rishayim zal, v'nosum v'nosbem. You have to have all the svarim. Today you have Safari or whatever, Oitzah Chachma, or whatever you're learning online, so it's easier. But it says, vani ha'yisichasar kol toiv, al beli heyois li kim gemara kama v'shvuas v'nazir. And babakama shvuas Nazir. V'chein is a sefer me b'chamer machrayim v'le ikrim shabeh. I had a few achrayim. The im kol zed nishanti al rachmov yisparach hu yigmar ba'adi lahamsi lefnei kolam mitzdarech. He should put everything in front of me that I need. V'gamarti lahaschal al koponim b'mitzvah u'min hashamayim isieni lehevi l'dei gmar tov. Hashem should help me to have it. And he says, therefore, I decided to work. Because he says I couldn't learn right away. I didn't have Gemara. I should look up. To look up to find the Gemara. It says, it's a very fascinating. He didn't have it there, and this is in Pisa. And it says, all the years I lived in Pisa. By the way, he ends up moving back to Venice later. He becomes a rabbi in Venice. We also have famous drushes from Ben Item. It says, I wrote most of it when I was in Pisa with no Gemara. I came back to become a Rav, etc. And he continues on, and he says, also fascinating to see what he says about the press. He says, Ubarachti kol ma sheyochalti melaharchiv lahayvi, to bring l'shaynish ala poiskim zalo hatega devarim keksavan greda, just to bring what they say. Kol shaloi oisif aleim is a never mechudesh. I don't want to barachti me. I ran away from quoting things that weren't chiddush. Why? Ki hashevach lekel yisparach. Praise be to Hashem. Moleh haaretz deya al yedei melechas atfus. He has filled the world with knowledge from the creation of the printing press. V'asvarim nintzim b'chol ever pina. Svarim are found everywhere, by the way, except Pisa. Umali lahagdil kamas chiburi. Why do I want to make my work so huge? Ulaharbes b'sefer kuntrasiv b'mashe chonan Hashem. L'chalik harava machaber who asher lo yamalti boy v'legidalti. Kimash that what had to do with me. Kimash nimtza l'gdolim asher kadmoini meviim b'chibureim divri zelasi. Says basically things that other was quoted. Why should I quote it? But he does end off again. He talks about the lack of svarim again. It says where he continues that tizos nachamasi kigdon okeach chazav yisparach lias lemishan li leman ein naki me'Hashem me'Yisrael. I should be free from Aveira. Ime Hashem ki golav yidul lefnei kisek voide kama v'kama yisi tomed miyiri hara b'chol eisa b'chol reg, all the times oimed v'doeg mespalam eschanish al yotza diver bilti mesukin v'intachas yadi. Right, nothing should go that's improper. And if Chashalom it did, Hashem should forgive me. He says, and hopefully not. To Imbi Yisrael, he says, B'zois ani bateach betuv levav akar hamuchter bekin hamaylas hamidois al gival al piv v'liba aymar lashmi. And you don't run to impugn me. Ki yasa loik, and if I am loris al morechas natzas v'ili lepel amelas praklit v'san eger. Kasher Yasim Neged Eni Kolam Soas Oisi Kasher Mirosh B'Sefer Dibarti. He says from Hein Meyois B'Roi V'Chibar Ani Levadi B'Li Rav Oichav. I didn't have anybody else. I just hadn't learned it. V'Hein Mechsar Nasvarim. I didn't have the proper books. Ikrim Amachrechem Asher Midei Zman V'Idan Hayoysim Lemekutem Uboim Lekrasi Achisi Kaisim Kafi Ashar Medalig Al Ashorim Mekapes Al Ashmuis. He's being Malitza over there, but he's like I just like wrote whatever I thought. Again, it's quite interesting how he's writing this whole thing. Like he just wrote what he thought, and he didn't have the books. Then he got back to Venice, and they did have it. Maybe they didn't have it. Maybe they didn't have it. I don't know. It's not clear like what was going on in Venice at the time. Did he have or did he not have? This is in the 17th century in Venice already. They should have had, but it's not like here. And he says, therefore, you should be down like Avschos. Ulai ba b'toich dvarei eze inyan efsh yimse kosov asher heged say mechaber zulasi be'eze sefer acher. Maybe it was in somewhere else, and I didn't know. And it's very long, and he's going on really very apologetic. There's more paragraphs. I don't want to already read a lot. I want to read more of this. So you see, again, the Shulchan Gebarim is earlier than him, and they're kind of do overlap, but the Shulchan Gebarim is older than him. So you see, this is a common issue. Lack of Svarim in general, even though he says that the press is all over, but B, post-burning and post-banning of Svarim, they're not all around. And you can find this, these are just a few quotes from a couple of Svarim. I mean, we know this from other Svarim. They're not around, they're harder to find, and for a while, the Gemara is hard to come by. I think the Ramifanu writes, Ilfas Ezuta also writes a short, riff. It's the same thing, and that's actually, Mechon Shlam reprinted it, or printed it from manuscript, I think. And so, there are those, they're working with other books because they don't have Gemara, really. But
even when they have it, we haven't talked really about the Shulchan Aruch yet, but you find that we have a manuscript that Dr. Edward Fram, I'm very grateful for him for identifying this. It was, it's the Ramah on the Shulchan Aruch, but it's just the Ramah. So somebody had a copy of the Shulchan Aruch before the Ramah was printed with it, but they wanted the Ramah's commentary on it. They wanted the Mapah. And so they made a manuscript that goes with a copy of the Shulchan Aruch that doesn't have Ramah in it because it was first printed without Ramah. And so they would make a manuscript of it. They made a manuscript of the copy that had Ramah, because there just weren't enough copies to go around. So you find that there's all this, we'll talk about this a little bit more next time, but the manuscript and handwritten books still continued because they couldn't get enough books. They wanted more and more Sfarim. There were just not enough to go around, even without, maybe partially because of censorship, but also there was a lot of demand.
And this is unfortunately what happened. And then throughout the centuries, many Sfarim became censored. And so you go back to those original, they weren't censored. And then you find things being censored. That's another valid reason why we hold up to a pedestal these Tfus Rishon, because the Tfus Rishon often wasn't censored.
Was not censored. It was before censored.
Later on, they're censored, and things are taken out, and things are removed, and then Goy becomes Akum, and every word has changed, and we don't have all these, and Gemaras, many Gemaras are deleted, and nowadays we have things that are put back, but you had for a long time things were taken out. So that's really the censorship period, and then post-censorship things do change, but books are still being printed in Italy, although I think, is it accurate to say that this is the beginning of the end of, at least the downfall of the Golden Age of printing in Italy?
It sort of slows down. There are a couple of books, Svarim, that we should just mention. The Zohar, and I'm not going to step on your wonderful series with Dr. Kimchi, but that was printed at that time, and that's also another story of manuscripts being carefully selected to create a new book. The Sefer Hasidim is also manuscripts being sort of edited to make a new book. And then the Shulchan Aruch is a very big deal. And the fact that the Shulchan Aruch would then be printed with this Sephardi halacha book would be printed with an Ashkenazi commentary on it to sort of unite the Jewish world halachically is very, very important and relevant to the way that what's happening with print in the 16th century and how that impacts the Jewish world in a huge way.
Beis Yosef, there's a book that Mareinayim, whatever. That's obviously a first banned book that's printed, but again, an important book in many regards is printed there. So there are definitely a number of important and famous books that are printed in Italy, but I think it's going down. It's headed down, and print is moving out. We're going to talk about
north and east.
We're going to focus next episode, correct, on other parts of Europe and Constantinople and Salonika and Eretz Yisrael, and we'll get to, like I said, Prague and Poland, and then eventually Amsterdam. And there are other areas where print is moving away. Books are still being printed in Italy, However,
Yeah, but they just had to be much more careful with what they printed. So only certain kinds of books would be printed in Italy. So they're looking for other places. I mean, there's a Gemara that's then printed in Basel that's supposed to be like a quote unquote kosher Gemara. Doesn't include Maseches Avodah Zarah at all. And nobody buys it. It's a complete flop. And then in Krakow, they produce just Maseches Avodah Zarah, sort of like, well, we know you guys can't get this anywhere else, so we're going to produce it here so that you can add it to your copy that doesn't have Avodah Zarah in it.
even though Poland is a Catholic country.
Yeah, but it was different. It was different. They didn't have the same kind of regulations, strictness, possibly because of the rulers had more control. I don't want to speculate because I'm going to get this wrong.
It's just an interesting point to point out. Yeah, obviously things did change, and the Sfarim moved around at the time. And we discussed. So there's a number of other things just to hit on. We did discuss Haskamas, the Haskama of the Agar, and other Sfarim, and Haskamas were a way of. Again, referring to the other episode, I think the Haskamas originally was really a copyright device, if you will. It wasn't so much saying like this is a good kosher sefer that you could use, like or like.
But
the Machaber's a great guide.
Then it also became
correct.
that.
It does.
It was like that. This is actually a good sefer that you should read.
Correct. And so Venice declines from its golden age. There's still large farm being printed, still important farm. Think about it. In the 17th century, the Arachaim HaKadosh is printed there in Venice. So, and that's the first edition of it. Massively influential, important Jewish book. So there are definitely things printed, but it's smaller. It's not as important and influential as opposed to other
printing moves
areas.
elsewhere where it's safer to
and
print.
it certainly doesn't have that monopoly that it had throughout, especially the beginning.
Certainly
of
the first half
16th
of the 16th century. Yeah,
and all our classics are printed. And so, with that, I think we really get to the end of the second episode of the series, and stay tuned. Coming up for the, I think next episode we're really going to turn to the spread of print and where print moves in the latter half of the 16th century and then outward. So again, we did term this series the history of the early printed Hebrew book. So we focused mostly these two episodes really on that, and we're going to move a little outward. But we're still in the early printed Hebrew book, really going to the rest of Europe in episode 3. But then we'll move. We'll do like a cursory glance at a little bit of the later centuries, and then before we move on episode 4. Into kind of a little bit on Vilna and Rum, and then we'll talk a little bit about into the digital age today. And so it's still the early Hebrew printed book, but how it all connects to the early Hebrew printed book. So thank you, Michelle, for joining me once again.
Thank you.